They didn't come to help her. They came to take her children. 7 kids. 1 woman. 0 options. The winter of 1887 was already killing Black Ridge. And the men in that meeting hall had decided that Evelyn Hart's family was a problem to be solved, not saved. They had prices in mind. Ages. Which ones were strong enough to work? Which ones were too small to bother with? And then a man walked through that door, a man the whole town feared, and said 3 words that changed everything. I'll take all. If you've ever been left with nothing and still refuse to break, this story is for you. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this reaches. Hit that like button and stay with me until the very end. The meeting had been going for 40 minutes before anyone thought to look at Evelyn. That told her everything she needed to know. She was sitting in the 3rd row of the old clapboard assembly hall, the one that used to be a feed store before Harlan Briggs converted it after the rail company pulled out and took half the town's purpose with it. The wood still smelled like grain dust and mold, and the single iron stove in the corner was doing a miserable job of fighting off the November cold that pressed against every crack in the walls. Evelyn had her youngest, Clara, pressed against her chest under her coat. The baby was 14 months old and had been running a low fever for 3 days. She wasn't crying. She hadn't cried much lately, and that worried Evelyn far more than crying would have. The other 6 children were arranged along the bench beside her and behind her, the older ones keeping the younger ones still, all of them quiet in the way that children get quiet when they understand, on some animal level, that the adults around them are deciding something important. Tobias, her oldest at 13, sat with his arms folded and his jaw set. He had his father's jaw. Sometimes she could barely look at him. The men at the front of the room were talking about spring planting. Or rather, they were talking about the impossibility of spring planting, given the state of the town's stores and the length of the winter ahead, and the particular burden of certain situations that had developed among the remaining population of Black Ridge. Evelyn knew she was a situation. She had known it since the day in late October when Reverend Marsh had come to her door with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that was trying very hard to be compassionate and landing somewhere closer to relieved. Her husband, Thomas, had been dead 6 weeks by then. Fever. Fast and ugly, the way frontier fevers tended to be. Tuesday he was coughing, Friday she was digging. She'd done the digging herself because neither of her closest neighbors, the Aldrich family and old Pete Sunner, had offered to help, and she wasn't going to ask. She wasn't built for asking. That had always been Thomas's complaint about her. Evelyn, you'd rather drown than call for a rope. He'd said it with love, mostly. And she'd laughed, mostly. But standing at the grave she'd dug with her own hands, the ground so cold the shovel kept sparking on rocks, she'd thought, Thomas, I don't think you're wrong. Now it was November, and Reverend Marsh was standing at the front of the hall with a piece of paper in his hands, and he was reading numbers. 214 pounds of flour, combined stores, which sounds like a considerable amount, until you account for 23 remaining households, not all of them able-bodied, and a projected winter duration of, just get to the point, Marsh. That was Cal Dennett, who ran what remained of the trading post. He was a thick man with a red beard that had gone patchy at the chin, and he had the particular impatience of someone who already knew what he wanted and was tired of waiting for the meeting to arrive at it. We all know why we're here. A ripple of discomfort moved through the room. People shifted. Someone coughed. Reverend Marsh set down his paper. He looked at Evelyn. There it was. Mrs. Hart, he said, and his voice carried the careful gentleness of a man diffusing something. We want you to know that this community cares deeply about you and your children. Here it comes, she thought, but the reality of our situation requires us to have a frank conversation about what's to be done with them, Cal Dennett said flatly. The room went very quiet. Evelyn felt Clara shift against her chest. She put one hand against the baby's back, feeling the shallow rise and fall of her breathing, and she kept her face still. She had learned in the months since Thomas died that keeping her face still was a form of armor. If she let them see her panic, they would use it. Not cruelly, most of them, just practically, the way frontier people used everything that was available. I'm sitting right here, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. You can talk to me directly. Marsh had the grace to look uncomfortable. Of course. Yes. Evelyn, Mrs. Hart. A longer pause. Mrs. Hart, the community has been discussing your circumstances. 7 children is a significant, I'm aware of how many children I have. A significant number of mouths to feed through a winter that is shaping up to be particularly harsh. The Hendersons have already left for Cheyenne. The Pryor family just last week. Black Ridge is, we are reduced, and the resources we have. Say it plainly. She was surprised by her own voice. It had an edge in it she didn't entirely recognize. You've already decided something. Just say it. The men at the front exchanged glances. Cal Dennett rubbed the back of his neck. Old Doc Ellers, who had delivered 3 of her children and looked like he wished he were somewhere else entirely, stared at his boots. It was Lloyd Fassett who finally said it. Lloyd owned the livery, or what was left of it, and he had always been the kind of man who mistook bluntness for honesty. The children need to be placed, he said, separately. We've had some discussions. The Calhoun place in Ridgeton would take the oldest boy for farm work. The Morrison family over in Sweetwater said they'd take a girl, provided she's old enough to be useful in the house. Henniger's, stop. The word came out of Evelyn so hard that Clara startled against her chest. She pressed her hand to the baby's back again, steadying herself. Stop right there. Mrs. Hart, you are standing in front of me talking about my children like they are furniture you're trying to find room for. Her voice was shaking now. She couldn't stop it. My son, my daughters. You have names and prices all worked out already, don't you? Tobias goes to the Calhouns because he's big enough to work. Who gets the little ones? Who gets Clara? She's 14 months old, Lloyd. Her voice broke and she hated it. She pulled it back together with everything she had. She still doesn't sleep through the night. Lloyd Fassett had the decency to look away. We're not placing them, Reverend Marsh said, and the word he chose revealed exactly how long he'd been rehearsing this. We're ensuring their survival. The alternative, Evelyn said, is that I take care of my own children. With what? Cal Dennett said. He wasn't being cruel. That was the worst part. He was just being accurate. Thomas left you with $40 in debt and a cabin with a leaking roof. Your stores are, I know what my stores are. 3 weeks, maybe 4 if you stretch it. After that, I said I know. The hall went quiet again. Outside, the wind was picking up, that low moaning sound it made when it came down off the mountains with serious intent. Evelyn had grown up in this country. She knew what that sound meant. The real winter wasn't here yet. When it arrived, it would arrive hard. She looked around the room, 20, maybe 22 people. Some she had known for years. Margaret Holloway, who had sat with her when Thomas was dying. Pete Sunner, who had eaten at her table 3 times and never once offered to repair the fence he'd borrowed her husband to help him build. The Aldrich boys, both of them old enough to help, neither of them meeting her eyes. There was no rescue coming from these people. They weren't monsters. They were just scared and hungry and looking for the solution that cost them the least. She understood it. She even, somewhere deep and cold inside herself, understood why separating her family made a terrible practical sense. She would die before she allowed it. I need time, she said. A week. Give me 1 week. To do what? Lloyd asked. To figure something out. The men looked at each other. Some kind of silent negotiation passed between them. Marsh clasped his hands. Mrs. Hart, he said, I don't think... The door opened. It didn't open loudly. No dramatic bang, no gust of wind. It just opened, the latch clicking, the hinges turning, and the cold came in first before anyone even registered who was standing in the doorframe. He was tall. That was the first thing. Taller than Lloyd Fassett, who was the tallest man in the room, and broader through the shoulders in a way that suggested not bulk, but use. The build of a man who had spent years doing physical things that needed doing. He wore a heavy wool coat that had seen better decades, and a hat that had been reshaped by weather into something that was technically still a hat. His beard was dark, going gray at the edges, and his face had a scar running from the left cheekbone down to the jaw. It was old, fully healed, but it had set in a way that gave that side of his face a slight tension, like the skin was remembering something it would rather forget. He stood in the doorway for a moment, not speaking, looking at the room with dark eyes that took inventory the way a man checks a room for exits. The entire assembly had gone still. It was Tobias who broke the silence, leaning forward to whisper in Evelyn's ear, "Mama, that's Gideon Wolf." She knew the name. Everyone in Black Ridge knew the name, in the way that people know the names of things they're not entirely sure are real. Half legend, half warning. Gideon Wolf, who had a cabin somewhere up in the high country, 4 or 5 miles above the timberline, who came down to trade maybe twice a year, spoke to no one more than necessary, and had once apparently walked away from a fight with 3 men that had left all 3 of them considerably worse off for the encounter. Nobody knew exactly what had happened up there in the mountains to make him the way he was. The stories varied. A dead wife featured in most versions. After that, the details scattered. He didn't look like a legend. He looked like a man who was very tired and had something to say, and was trying to decide whether to say it. "Wolflet," Cal Dennett said. Not a greeting exactly, more like an acknowledgement that something unexpected had entered the room. "Didn't know you were in town. Just passing through." His voice was low, roughened, the voice of a man who didn't use it much. He looked at Evelyn, not at the men at the front, not at the assembly, but directly at her, and for a moment she had the unsettling feeling of being weighed, not judged, just weighed, with a kind of precision that had nothing comfortable in it. Then he looked at the men. "Heard you talking from outside. Thin walls." "Community business," Marsh said carefully. "I heard." He stepped fully into the room and let the door close behind him. He didn't move toward the front. He just stood there, filling space that he hadn't been filling before. "You're splitting up the children. We're making practical arrangements for... You're splitting them up." He said it again without inflection. Not accusation, statement. Sending them out separate to work for strangers. The room was deeply uncomfortable now. There was something in his stillness that made people want to fidget. "The situation is what it is," Cal said, and he said it with a little less certainty than usual. Gideon Wolf looked at the children. He went down the row of them. Tobias with his folded arms, 12-year-old Samuel, who was trying to look brave and not managing it, the twins Ruth and Rachel at 10, James at 7, who had cried earlier and gone quiet with exhaustion, little Nora at 4, who was asleep against Samuel's shoulder, and Clara, a lump under Evelyn's coat, just her pale face visible. The look lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then he turned back to the room. "I'll take all of them." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than any that had come before it. It had texture, disbelief, calculation. A low murmur started somewhere in the back of the room and spread. "I beg your pardon," Marsh said. "The woman and her children." He said it without looking at Evelyn. "I'll take them. Up to my place for the winter. I've got room and I've got stores." A pause. "Enough." Lloyd Fassett actually laughed, a short, bewildered sound. "Wolf, you live alone on a mountain. You've never..." He trailed off, apparently unable to find the sentence. "I know where I live." "There are 7 children," Marsh said, as if perhaps the man had miscounted. "I heard you say it 3 times, still 7. He finally looked at Evelyn. "Your choice, ma'am. I'm not forcing anything." Evelyn looked at him. She was trying to find the angle in it. The price, the exchange, the thing he wanted that she hadn't figured out yet. Because in her experience, offers that looked like rescue were rarely what they appeared. Thomas had taught her that. No. Thomas had taught her to want to believe in people. And the world after Thomas had taught her the other lesson. She looked at his hands. They were scarred, too. The knuckles, the back of the right hand. Working scars, most of them. But there was a steadiness to the way he stood that wasn't aggressive. It was just present. He wasn't performing anything for the room. He wasn't looking around to see if people were impressed. "You don't know us," she said. "No." "You don't owe us anything." "No." "Then why?" He was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone looking for a good answer, the silence of someone who had an honest answer and wasn't sure it was worth explaining. "Because they shouldn't be separated," he finally said. "That's all." It wasn't enough. It wasn't nearly enough. But Cal Dennett was looking at her with that practical impatience, and the baby was warm and too quiet against her chest, and the wind outside was saying winter, winter, winter in a language anyone raised in this country could read. "I need a moment," she said. She turned to Tobias. His jaw was still set, But his eyes, Thomas's eyes, were asking her something that he was too old, already too old at 13, to say out loud. Is this safe? She didn't know. She genuinely did not know. The Wolf Place, she said, low enough that only he heard. Do you know anything about it? Billy Crenshaw's older brother went up there once, trading, said it was solid, good construction. Tobias paused. Said Wolf wasn't friendly. Not friendly isn't dangerous. No, Tobias agreed. Then, Mama, we can't let them split us up. She knew. She'd already known the answer before she asked the question. She just needed a moment to stand next to the knowing and make sure it was real. She stood up. Claire stirred against her, made a small unhappy sound, and settled back. Mr. Wolf, Evelyn said. He looked at her. I have 7 children and nothing else. No money to contribute for food or supplies. We'll work for our keep. All of us. The ones old enough. But I want your word, in front of these people, that my children will be safe. She held his gaze. I'm not asking for promises about spring or the future, just the winter. Safe for the winter. He looked at her steadily. You have my word. Then I accept. The room erupted. Not violently, mostly just noise, the scraping of benches, the rapid exchange of opinions, Marsh saying something about irregular, and Lloyd Fassett asking Cal something under his breath. Evelyn didn't listen to any of it. She was already calculating what to pack, what to leave, how to get 7 children, and whatever she could carry up the mountain before the storm, she could hear building in the pitch of the wind. Tobias stood beside her, already wearing the expression he'd been practicing all fall, the one that was trying to be the man of the family and barely containing the boy underneath. I don't like him, he said quietly. You don't have to like him. She was folding the edge of her coat more firmly around Clara. You have to survive the winter, yes. They left at first light the next morning. She had packed through the night, moving through the cabin by lamplight with the systematic calm of someone who has made peace with necessity. The furniture stayed. The dishes she'd carried from Missouri, hand-wrapped in Thomas's shirts, mostly stayed. She took the practical things, blankets, the cast-iron pot, her sewing kit, the small collection of medicines she'd built up over 6 years of children getting sick and injured in the various creative ways children managed. She took Thomas's hunting rifle, even though she was only a fair shot and hadn't touched it since he died. She took it because the alternative was leaving it. The children had packed themselves, more or less. Tobias had made sure the younger ones limited themselves to what they could actually carry. Samuel, who was quieter than Tobias and thought more than he said, had repacked Nora's bag twice without being asked because she kept putting toys in it and leaving out her warm stockings. Gideon Wolf arrived at the cabin an hour before dawn. He had a wagon, a battered thing pulled by a horse that was old but looked sensible, and he loaded their things into it without speaking, without commenting on how little there was or how much, just methodically fitting it all in. The children watched him from the porch. He's scary, Ruth said. Ruth was the more straightforward of the twins. He's big, Rachel amended. Rachel preferred accuracy. Same thing, said James, who was 7 and had a 6-year-old's logic about these things, and a 6-year-old's confidence that he was right. Nora had fallen asleep standing up, leaning against the doorframe, and nobody had the heart to move her yet. Evelyn locked the cabin door, then stood for a moment with her hand on the wood. 6 years of her life were inside those walls. Thomas was inside those walls, in some way that she couldn't explain and wouldn't try to. The hole his absence made in her life had not gotten smaller. She'd just gotten better at walking around it. She put the key in her coat pocket. She turned around. All right, she said to her children. Let's go. What? The road, such as it was, ran for about 2 miles before it stopped being a road and became a suggestion. After that, it was a trail, defined by use, not by design, threading through pine forest and over creek beds frozen to a dull gray. The wagon handled the lower portion well enough. Higher up, when the grade steepened, Gideon stopped and redistributed the load, moving the heavier bags to the wagon's center of gravity in a way that suggested he'd done this particular calculation before. He didn't explain what he was doing. He didn't ask for help. He just did it. Tobias watched him do it, and Evelyn watched Tobias watch him, and she thought, this is going to be complicated. The climb took most of the day. They stopped twice, once to let the horse rest, Once when James needed to be sick at the side of the trail from motion and nerves, and probably some combination of fear and not enough breakfast. Both times, Gideon waited without comment. No impatience, but no comfort either. Just patience. The particular patience of someone who has learned to wait without attachment to the waiting ending. The children talked in the back of the wagon, the older ones keeping the younger ones occupied with stories and small arguments, the normal weathers of siblings. Evelyn sat on the wagon bench beside Gideon, not beside exactly, there was a foot of space between them, and tried to think of something reasonable to say and couldn't. He didn't seem to need conversation. He watched the trail, guided the horse, scanned the tree line the way a person does when they've made a habit of knowing what's in the landscape around them. "How long have you been up here?" she finally asked. Halfway up, maybe more, the trees thinning and the view opening behind them to show the shrinking smudge of Black Ridge below. He considered the question the same way he'd considered her earlier one, not evasively, just carefully. 8 years. Alone? Yes. She left a space in the conversation in case he wanted to fill it. He didn't. "The children are going to make noise," she said. "I want you to know that. It's not possible to make them quiet all the time, especially the little ones. I know what children are. I just mean, I know." A pause. "It'll be fine." She didn't entirely believe him, but she noted that he'd said it without the particular weariness that would have indicated resignation. He'd said it the way a person states a fact they've decided to hold to. She supposed that was something. But the cabin appeared in the last gray hour before dark. It was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said precisely what she had expected. Something rougher, maybe. Dirtier. More obviously abandoned to bachelor habits. What it was, instead, was solid. Built from logs with the kind of notching that took real skill, chinked carefully, the roof steep enough to shed snow and intact enough to actually do so. There was a covered porch, a wood pile that was enormous. She'd never seen one that big. It ran the entire length of the cabin's east wall, and an outbuilding that turned out, on inspection, to contain a small stable and storage. The inside was one large room with a loft above it that was accessed by a rough-cut ladder. The fireplace was massive, proportioned for serious heat rather than aesthetics. The floor was swept. There was a table, plain and heavy, big enough for 6 people in a pinch. There was one bed, one chair that looked like it had been made by hand, and more shelves than Evelyn had ever seen in a single room. Shelves covering most of 3 walls, stacked with organized stores, jars, dried goods, carefully maintained tools, equipment she couldn't immediately identify. The children stopped in the doorway and stared. "It's so quiet," Nora said, with the reverence of a child who had spent her whole life sharing a small space with 6 siblings. Gideon stood in the middle of the room and looked at them looking at it. Something moved across his face. Not regret exactly, but the recognition of something changing that had been a certain way for a long time. "Loft sleeps 4, maybe 5 if they're not large," he said. "Women and the little ones down here by the fire. He stopped. He clearly hadn't thought this particular part through. "I'll sort out the sleeping." "The children can share the loft," Evelyn said. "All of them, the older ones on the outer sides to keep the younger ones from rolling off. I'll sleep down here with the baby." He looked at her with something that might have been appreciation for the practical solution, stripped of anything more comfortable than that. "Fine," he said. "And you?" "Outbuilding has a cot." He moved to the fireplace and crouched in front of it, reaching for the tinderbox on the nearby shelf. "It's not heated, but I've slept in worse." "You shouldn't. This is your home. You don't have to—" "Mrs. Hart." He looked back at her over his shoulder. "It's not a conversation. I said I'll sort it." He turned back to the fire. "There's a hook for the coat, there by the door. The well is 20 feet behind the outbuilding. Don't let the little ones go near it alone. The cover's loose." He paused. "Supper. I'll cook tonight, since you don't know where anything is. Tomorrow you'll learn where things are." She stood there for a moment looking at the back of him. The broad shoulders, the careful economy of his movements as he built the fire, the way the children were cautiously spreading out behind her, exploring the edges of the new space with the instinctive wariness of animals entering unfamiliar territory. She thought, "I have made an enormous decision based on almost no information, in a desperate situation, and I have no way of knowing yet whether it was right. And then, but the fire is going, and the roof is solid, and at least we're together. It wasn't hope, it was smaller than hope. It was just the next thing, the thing after the impossible thing, the ordinary continuation of a life that had not stopped. She hung up her coat on the hook by the door. "Children," she said, "put your bags in the loft. Samuel, help Nora up the ladder. Ruth, you're responsible for keeping your sister from doing anything dangerous until I say otherwise. Tobias?" She looked at her oldest son, who was standing in the doorway still, watching Gideon with that particular set to his face. "Tobias, come inside." He came. Slowly, but he came. Bamitam. Supper was bean soup with dried venison, plain and adequate. Gideon cooked it without ceremony and served it without much ceremony either. Bowls passed down the table, bread torn from a loaf he'd apparently baked 2 days before, a hardness to it that no one complained about. The children were exhausted and ate quietly, which was unusual enough that Evelyn kept checking faces for signs of illness before she understood that they were just overwhelmed. Even James, who was generally incapable of being in a room without narrating it, ate in silence, watching Gideon with wide eyes over the rim of his bowl. Gideon ate at the end of the table and did not speak. After supper, Evelyn put the little ones to bed. Nora went down immediately. Ruth and Rachel allowed themselves to be settled after some negotiation about blanket distribution. James needed a story, which Samuel told in a low voice while Evelyn watched from the ladder. Clara she nursed and held until the baby was fully out, that complete surrender of infant sleep, and then laid her carefully in the blanket nest she'd arranged near the fire. She came back to the table to find Tobias and Gideon sitting at opposite ends, not speaking. The silence between them had its own specific quality. It wasn't peaceful. "Tobias," she said, "bed. I'm not tired." "Then lie there and be awake quietly." She kept her voice even. "Loft. Now." He went, but not without one long look at Gideon that was carrying approximately 10 different unasked questions. Gideon met the look without expression and didn't look away until Tobias did. When the boy was up the ladder, Evelyn sat down at the table with a weight that was mostly relief and partly grief, the combination that had become her most common emotional state. She looked at her hands on the tabletop. Rough hands now. They hadn't been rough before Thomas died. Work will do that. "He's protective," she said, without being sure whether she was explaining or apologizing. "I know." Gideon had a cup of something, coffee, or what passed for it up here. He was looking at the fire, not at her. "He should be. He'll settle." "He doesn't have to settle." A pause. "This is a strange situation. He's allowed to think so." She looked at him. The fire was doing good work on the room now, throwing heat and light, and in it he looked less severe than he had in the thin winter daylight. Not softer, just more present somehow. "Why did you do it?" she asked. Not the version of the question she'd asked in the meeting hall, the public version, the one that needed an answer the room could understand. The actual question. Not the town meeting answer, the real one. He was quiet for a while. She waited, having learned already that his quiet was not deflection. "I heard Lloyd Fassett say the Calhoun place, and I knew what that meant for the boy," he finally said. "Calhoun works children like their equipment. I've seen it." He looked at his cup. "And then I heard you say I know what my stores are in that particular voice, and I thought—" He stopped. "What?" "That you were going to try to do the impossible thing alone and fail, and they'd separate the children anyway after a worse winter." He set down the cup. "At least this way the odds are better." It was practical. It was almost purely practical. She found that she trusted it more than she would have trusted sentiment. "I'll pull my weight," she said. "All of us will." "I know." And somehow from him it didn't sound like a platitude. It sounded like an assessment. She stood up, smoothed her skirt from habit, looked at the room that was going to have to contain 9 people and all their human complications through whatever the mountain decided to throw at them. "Thank you," she said, "for tonight." He nodded once, already standing, moving toward the door and whatever the cold of the outbuilding held for him. "Sleep while you can, Mrs. Hart," he said, and he said it without irony. "Weather's coming." She listened to the wind as the door closed behind him. "Weather's coming." She looked at the fire, at the sleeping shape of her daughter, at the solid walls of a cabin that belonged to a stranger. She thought of Thomas. She thought of the empty cabin down the mountain with the key in her coat pocket. She thought, I don't know what this is, but we're alive and we're together. Outside, the wind picked up. The mountain made its sounds, the deep creak of pine trees taking the strain, the snow beginning to hiss against the walls, the world narrowing to the small circle of warmth and the long darkness beyond it. Evelyn Hart lay down near the fire, pulled her blanket around herself and Clara, and closed her eyes. She did not sleep for a long time, but eventually she did. The first week was the hardest thing Evelyn had done since digging Thomas's grave. Not because Gideon was cruel, not because the cabin was unbearable, but because 9 people crammed into a space built for one creates a particular kind of friction that has nothing to do with anyone being wrong. It's just the physics of too much life in too little room, and no amount of goodwill makes the math work cleanly. The mornings were the worst. Clara woke first, usually before light, and her crying woke Nora, and Nora waking up was never a quiet event. By the time Evelyn had the baby settled and the fire built back up from its overnight coals, Ruth and Rachel were coming down the ladder arguing about something that had apparently started in a dream and carried over into waking life, and James would appear at the loft edge, demanding to know what was for breakfast with the particular urgency of a 7-year-old who had decided that hunger was an emergency requiring immediate announcement. Gideon came in from the outbuilding each morning at the same time, face reddened from the cold, and walked into whatever chaos had developed with an expression that Evelyn could not read. Not anger, not amusement. Something more like a man watching weather, noting conditions, making assessments, not taking it personally. The third morning he came in to find James standing on the table. James was not standing on the table for any particular reason. He had climbed up there and then apparently forgotten why, and was now just standing on it, looking out the high window at the snow, in the way that 7-year-olds sometimes occupy spaces that were not designed for them. Gideon stopped in the doorway. James looked at him. I can see the whole mountain from up here, James said. Gideon looked at the table, looked at James. Get down. But, James. Evelyn didn't look up from where she was nursing Clara by the fire. She didn't need to. James got down. Slowly, in the way that children perform compliance while making clear it is a performance. Gideon crossed to the fire, poured coffee, and stood with his back to the room drinking it. And Evelyn, watching him from the corner of her eye, saw the very slight movement of his shoulders. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, something that existed in the territory between them, and filed it away. He was not as impenetrable as he was performing. That was useful to know. The children sorted themselves out around him in stages, the way animals establish territory. Ruth and Rachel, who were bold in the particular way of twins who have always had each other as backup, started speaking to him directly by the 4th day, mostly questions about the cabin, the mountain, the tools hanging on the walls. He answered them briefly and accurately, and without the false brightness that adults often perform for children. They seemed to find this acceptable. Ruth, who was the more aggressive questioner of the two, had extracted from him by the end of the week the information that the notched logs in the cabin's east wall had taken him 3 weeks to cut and fit, that the horse's name was Marshall, and he was 12 years old and had opinions about the cold, and that the shelf above the fireplace held what he called his working tools, and were not to be touched by anyone. What's a working tool? Ruth had asked. Tools I use for work. That's not a real answer. A pause. No. It isn't. He'd looked at her for a moment. Trapping equipment, knives, things that can hurt you if you don't know how to use them. Ruth had accepted this. Rachel had immediately looked at the shelf with enhanced interest, which Evelyn noted and addressed later. Nora was afraid of him for the first 5 days and spent most of her time pressing against Evelyn's side when he was in the room. On the 6th day, she was sitting near the fire with the small cloth rabbit she'd brought from home when Gideon came in, stomped snow from his boots, and crossed toward the fireplace. He stopped, because Nora was in his path and hadn't moved, frozen like a small deer clutching the rabbit, staring up at him. He crouched down so he was at her level. This clearly surprised her. What's his name? He said, nodding at the rabbit. She blinked at him. Henry? Henry. He said it like he was considering it. Good name. He stood up, stepped around her, and went to the fire. Nora watched him for a moment, then looked at Evelyn with an expression of confused reassessment. After that, she was less afraid. Not comfortable, she still gave him space, but the frozen terror was gone, replaced by a cautious curiosity that was more her natural state. Tobias was a different problem entirely. He was not openly hostile. Evelyn had made clear in the wagon on the way up, in terms that left no room for interpretation, that she expected courtesy. And Tobias was courteous, technically. He said what needed to be said, helped where he was told to help, didn't make scenes. But there was a quality to his cooperation that made it feel more like protest than participation. He watched Gideon the way Evelyn had seen Thomas watch men he didn't trust. Not the watching of fear, but the watching of someone keeping count. Gideon, for his part, neither pushed nor retreated from it. He gave Tobias real work, not make work, sent him out to check the woodpile, showed him once how to check the joints on the snowshoes for wear, told him without softening it when he'd stacked wood wrong and why it mattered that the weight distributed evenly. He didn't soften any of it. He also didn't perform patience. He just treated Tobias like someone whose help was actually needed and left the rest of it alone. Evelyn watched this and thought, he either knows exactly what he's doing or he doesn't think about it at all. She couldn't tell which, and she wasn't sure it made a difference. The rhythms of the cabin established themselves gradually, not by agreement, but by repetition. Evelyn took over the cooking by the second day. Not because Gideon's food was bad, but because she needed something to control, and the kitchen was the most natural place for that need to go. She organized the children's days, lessons in the morning, the older ones teaching the younger ones what they knew, because she was not going to let a winter pass without her children learning something. Samuel, who had an unexpected gift for patience, became the primary teacher, working through sums and letters with James and Nora at the table while Evelyn cooked, and Gideon moved in and out of the cabin doing whatever the endless maintenance of a mountain life required. In the afternoons, when the light was still good, Gideon took whoever was willing outside. Not formally. He just went. And if children followed, he tolerated it. Ruth and Rachel always followed. James followed whenever he could convince Evelyn he'd finished his lessons, which was a moving target. Samuel came sometimes, quiet beside Gideon in a way that was less companionable than simply parallel. Two people occupying the same space without requiring anything of each other. He showed them things without announcing that he was showing them things. The particular way snow settled around a tree trunk that told you wind direction. Which ice on the creek surface would hold weight and which would not. The marks a rabbit made in fresh snow versus a day-old snow, and why it mattered. He didn't lecture. He observed, and if someone was watching, they might observe too. One afternoon, Evelyn came out to call James in for supper and found Gideon crouched beside the boy in front of a rabbit track pointing at something in the snow. James was leaning forward with his full 7-year-old attention, which was not something James gave easily. She stopped at the porch edge and did not call out immediately. See how the back feet land ahead of the front? Gideon was saying. That's the gallop pattern, means it was moving fast. Was something chasing it? Maybe. Or it just spooked. He looked up at the tree line. Either way, it came through here this morning, before the new snow covered the edges. Could we catch it? With a snare, yes. He stood up. Not today, day after tomorrow, if the weather holds. Could you show me? A pause that Evelyn had learned by now to read as Gideon doing actual consideration rather than deflecting. Could, if your mother says it's all right. James turned and found Evelyn watching from the porch. Mama, can I learn snares? She looked at Gideon. He looked back at her, that level waiting look that gave nothing away and asked for nothing more than a yes or no. Fine, she said, after lessons. James made a sound that was pure, uncomplicated happiness and ran past her into the cabin to tell Samuel, and Evelyn found herself standing on the porch looking at Gideon across 20 feet of cold air and silence, not entirely sure what she was feeling. Thank you, she said. He shrugged. Useful skill. Still. He nodded and went back to the woodpile, and she went back inside, and she thought for the rest of the evening about a man who'd moved 40 years of solitude to make room for a 7-year-old's enthusiasm, and called it a useful skill, and believed that was sufficient explanation. Maybe it was. The real winter arrived at the end of their second week on the mountain. It didn't arrive gradually. Evelyn had grown up in country that had winters, but this was mountain winter, which was a different thing. A commitment, not a season. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in a single night and kept going. The sky turned the particular white-gray that meant serious snow. And then the snow came. Not the soft, pretty kind, but the driven horizontal kind that found every gap and piled against every vertical surface and turned the 20 feet between the cabin and the outbuilding into a journey that required thought. On the third day of the storm, the wind was loud enough inside the cabin to raise voices over, and Nora cried from the noise of it, and Clara was feverish again, and Evelyn sat up half the night with the baby in her arms by the fire, watching the flames and listening to the mountain make its sounds, and thinking about all the ways things could go wrong. Gideon came in sometime after midnight. He'd been checking the outbuilding, making sure Marshall was secure. He was snow-coated to the shoulders, and his face was raw from the cold, and he stopped when he saw her awake. "Baby sick?" he said. "Just feverish. She gets them. She's had them since she was 3 months old." Evelyn looked down at Clara, who was sleeping now, finally, her small face flushed. "The doctor in Black Ridge said she'd grow out of it." Gideon crossed to the shelves and came back with a small tin. He set it on the table beside her without explanation. She looked at it. "What is this?" "Fever poultice. Willow bark, mostly, and some other things. My wife—" He stopped. Started again, the way a man starts again when he's crossed into territory he didn't intend to. "I made it a while ago. It helps with the fever, rubbed on the chest." Evelyn looked at him. He was looking at the tin, not at her. "Your wife," she said, not pushing, just leaving space. "She died." He said it flatly. Not to shut the conversation down, or maybe partly to shut it down, but also with the particular flatness of a fact repeated so many times it has worn smooth. 8 years ago, fever took her, same winter I built this place. "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily. Snow was melting off his coat in small rivulets. He hadn't taken it off yet. "Use the poultice or don't? Up to you." She opened the tin. It smelled sharp and medicinal, not unpleasant. She worked a small amount onto her fingers and carefully rubbed it onto Clara's chest, and the baby stirred but didn't wake. "What was her name?" Evelyn asked. A long silence. Outside, the wind made its long sound against the walls. "Margaret," he said. She hated the cold. There was something so specific in that detail. Not she was beautiful or she was kind, but she hated the cold. That Evelyn felt the weight of it the way you feel the weight of a true thing. "I'm sorry," she said again. And this time she meant the particular sorrow of understanding what it costs to love someone in a hard place and lose them. He looked at his hands. "You get used to the quiet after a while. That's the worst part, I think, that you get used to it." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Then 9 people show up." She almost smiled. "Is that a complaint?" He considered it with apparent seriousness. "Not exactly." Clara shifted in her arms, made a small sound of discomfort, and settled. Evelyn rocked her automatically, the deep muscle memory of 3 years of babies. The fire crackled. Outside, the storm pushed and moaned. "The children are loud," Gideon said. "Not complaining. Stating. Yes. James talks constantly." "He does. He came out talking and hasn't stopped." "Ruth asks questions that don't have easy answers. She always has. Thomas used to say she was going to be a lawyer." A pause. She hadn't said Thomas's name out loud to anyone in weeks. It sat in the air of the cabin for a moment, strange and familiar at once. "How long ago?" Gideon asked. 6 weeks before the town meeting. Fever." She adjusted Clara against her shoulder. 4 days, start to finish." He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of not knowing what to say. The quiet of knowing that some things don't require a response, just acknowledgement. "He had a good eye for people," Evelyn said. She wasn't sure why she was saying it. Maybe just because it was the middle of the night, and the storm was loud, and there was something about extreme circumstances that made pretense feel like too much work. He would have looked at you and found something to say. Thomas could always find something to say. Must have been useful. It was. I never had it. I find conversation. She made a small motion with her hand that meant difficult or unnecessary or both. Same, Gideon said. They sat in something that was, if not comfortable, at least honest. 2 people in a storm, a sleeping baby between them metaphorically, and the particular understanding of those who prefer silence to noise, but have found themselves in unusual proximity to both. After a while he stood up, checked that the fire was well stocked, and moved back toward the door. "Storm should break by Thursday," he said. "Maybe Wednesday." "How do you know?" "I've been on this mountain 8 years." He pulled the collar of his coat up. "You learned to read it." The door opened and the cold came in for a moment, and then he was gone back into the dark and the snow, and Evelyn sat with her daughter and the dying sound of the storm and thought about a man who had built himself a fortress of solitude so complete that even his grief was organized into shelves. She was glad he'd sat down. She wasn't sure he knew he'd needed to. The storm broke on Wednesday, as he'd said. Thursday came clear and brutally cold, the mountain emerging from under 3 new feet of snow with the particular crystalline sharpness of high-altitude winter after a storm. Everything was white and still, and the silence was so complete it had texture. The children came off the porch in a wave. Even Tobias, who had maintained his careful distance from anything resembling enjoyment, came out and stood in the new snow with his hands in his pockets and his face turned up to the pale sun with an expression that was simply, for a moment, 13 years old and nothing more complicated than that. Gideon watched them from the woodpile, where he was splitting the day's logs with the methodical rhythm of long practice. Evelyn came to stand a few feet away, Clara bundled against her chest. "You were right about Wednesday," she said. "Usually am, with weather." She watched the children. James had immediately fallen down in the snow on purpose and was now attempting to make a snow figure that wasn't going well. Nora stood at the edge of the porch, suspicious of the depth. Samuel was helping her navigate the steps. "Tobias," she said, not loudly. Across the yard, her oldest son looked over. "Go help Mr. Wolf with the wood." The pause that followed had several things in it, none of them simple. Tobias looked at Gideon. Gideon set down the axe and looked back at him with the level waiting patience that was apparently his only mode for dealing with the boy's resistance. Tobias walked over. He picked up a piece of split wood and carried it to the stack. Gideon split another piece. Tobias carried it. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then, "You're stacking it wrong," Gideon said. Tobias stopped. "What?" "Bark side down, not up. Water runs off the wood instead of into it. Keeps it from rotting." A beat. Tobias looked at the stack, looked at Gideon. "Nobody told me that." "Now somebody has." Another beat. Tobias unstacked the last 3 pieces and restacked them correctly, bark side down, and Gideon split more wood without comment, and that was how it started. Not with warmth or resolution or any dramatic moment of connection, but with bark side down instead of up, and the simple utility of a thing done correctly. Evelyn watched and felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Not relief, not yet, but the possibility of relief, somewhere ahead. The weeks after the storm settled into a routine that was hard but had shape to it, and shape was something Evelyn could work with. Mornings, fire, breakfast, lessons. Afternoons, outdoor work, tasks assigned by Gideon or chosen from the constant list of things a mountain cabin required to function. Evenings, supper, sometimes a story. The children to bed in stages. She and Gideon rarely spent evenings in prolonged conversation, but they shared the table sometimes over coffee, that willow bark approximation he made, and said the necessary things and occasionally the unnecessary things, and it was fine. It was not easy, but it was fine. She learned the cabin. She learned where he kept things and why they were kept that way. Every choice made for function. Nothing decorative, nothing sentimental except one thing. On the high shelf above the bed, tucked against the wall where you wouldn't see it unless you were looking, there was a small blue ribbon. She never asked about it. She was certain it had been Margaret's. She learned his patterns. He woke before dawn, always. He rarely spoke before his coffee. He checked the weather first thing every morning, not from a window, but from the door, standing in the cold for a moment with his eyes on the sky, reading something she couldn't fully read yet. He was meticulous about tools, everything cleaned, everything returned to its place, and quietly irritated when things weren't, though he never said so directly, just put them back himself with a particular quality of silence. He learned her patterns too, she realized. He stopped walking through the kitchen area without warning when she had hot things on the fire, which she hadn't asked him to do. He started knocking on the door before coming in from outside in the mornings, which again she'd never requested. Small adjustments, made without announcement, that said, "I am paying attention, even when I don't show it." The children were harder to read in different ways. Claire's fever broke properly in their third week and didn't return, which lifted a weight from Evelyn she hadn't fully acknowledged carrying. Nora had settled into the cabin life with the adaptability of small children. She had her corner, her rabbit, her routines, and she was fine. James had thrown himself into every piece of outdoor knowledge Gideon was willing to impart with the kind of wholehearted commitment that was entirely his character. The snare lesson had happened and been a moderate success, resulting in 2 rabbits and 1 small catastrophe when James had checked the snare alone and come back to the cabin with a rabbit and a badly lacerated hand from trying to manage the snare by himself. Gideon had looked at the hand, looked at James, and said, "Never alone," in a tone that James had apparently decided to take seriously because he hadn't done it again. Ruth was learning to track. Rachel had become fascinated with the way Gideon read weather and followed him outside every morning now, serious and watchful, learning the language of cloud and wind and barometric pressure expressed through the behavior of snow. Samuel helped wherever he was needed and asked for very little, which worried Evelyn more than the louder children. She knew Samuel absorbed things quietly and let them work on him in the dark, and she tried to find time for just the 2 of them, which was not easy in a small cabin with 7 children. Tobias was the one she watched most carefully. He was settling, or something adjacent to settling. He worked with Gideon without open resistance now, and there were moments, more frequent as December deepened, where she caught them in actual conversation. Not long conversations, functional ones mostly. Tobias asking questions about the mountain, or the tools, or the weather, Gideon answering without simplifying. She noticed that Gideon never talked down to him, treated him like someone whose opinion on practical things was worth having. Tobias was 13 and carrying the weight of feeling responsible for a family that wasn't his responsibility to carry, and there was something in the way Gideon gave him real information, real stakes, real problems to think through, that was slowly, imperfectly, doing something useful for him. She didn't say any of this to Gideon. She wasn't sure it would survive the saying. By the 4th week, the cold had settled in so deep and permanent that it stopped feeling like weather and started feeling like the natural state of the world, as if warmth had been a temporary arrangement, and this was what the mountain actually was. The wood consumption was higher than Gideon had calculated for, because he had calculated for 1 person and 9 people opening and closing the door and running in and out and requiring the fire built up for baths and cooking. And the baby, 9 people were using heat in ways that 1 man's precise calculation had not accounted for. He didn't say anything about it. She noticed. "We're using too much wood," she told him one evening. "We have enough." "For how long?" He was quiet for a moment. Honest quiet, the calculating kind. "Through February, maybe into March, if we're careful." "And if we're not careful?" "We'll be careful." She looked at him. "That's not an answer." "It is an answer, it's just not the one you want." He looked back at her steadily. "We'll be careful because we need to be. I've been in worse situations on this mountain alone. With 9 people, the math is different, but the principle is the same. You manage what you have." "And if managing isn't enough?" He was quiet for a beat, then, "I'll figure it out." She would remember that later. She would remember the simple certainty of it, and the way it was delivered without drama or reassurance, just a statement of intent from a man who had apparently made a habit of meaning what he said. She would remember it because of what came after, and how brutally that certainty was tested. For now, though, December was holding. The cabin was warm enough. The children were alive and fed and together. The mountain was hard, and it was vast, and it was indifferent to all of them in the particular way that wild places are indifferent. Not hostile, just honest. There were harder things coming. She could feel them the way she'd learned to feel the weather. In the small things, the way the stores were beginning to look different when she opened them, the quality of silence from Gideon when she asked about the food supply, the way he'd started going out a little farther each day with his rifle and coming back with less. She knew. She'd always been good at reading what people didn't say, but for now, Nora was asleep with Henry the rabbit under one arm. James had worn himself out in the snow and gone down before supper. Ruth and Rachel were doing some elaborate whispering in the loft that was clearly an ongoing project. Samuel was reading by firelight, the serious, careful reading of someone who treats books like they might run out. Tobias was sharpening a knife that Gideon had given him the week before. Given him, not lent him, and he was doing it with the focused attention of someone taking a responsibility seriously. Gideon was outside, checking the sky. Evelyn put another log on the fire, looked at her family arranged in the warmth and the light, and held on to it. Just this. Just right now. The rest of it could wait until it couldn't. The food stores ran out on a Tuesday, not all at once. It wasn't a dramatic moment of opening a barrel and finding it empty. It was more like watching a tide go out, gradual and then suddenly final. The flour had been stretched for 3 weeks before it became something that could only be described as flour by generosity of definition. The dried beans went the week after Christmas. The venison Gideon had stored, a careful, methodical accumulation of months of solo hunting, had lasted longer than she'd expected because Evelyn had been quietly having portions since early December, cutting her own down to almost nothing and hoping the children didn't notice. Tobias noticed. He didn't say anything, just started leaving half his portion on the edge of his bowl and pushing it toward Nora without looking at Evelyn, and she had to turn toward the fire for a moment when she saw it. By mid-January, what they had left was a partial sack of cornmeal, 3 jars of preserved plums from the summer before, a modest amount of dried herbs that were useless without something to put them in, and approximately 12 pounds of salt pork that Gideon had discovered in the back of the outbuilding storage, forgotten behind a broken trap. 12 pounds of salt pork for 9 people in the deep of a mountain winter was not a food supply. It was a delay. Gideon did the accounting at the table on a Tuesday evening after the children were asleep, and Evelyn sat across from him and watched him work through it. He didn't dramatize it. He just laid out what they had, measured it against what 9 people required per day at minimum, and reached the end of the calculation with the stillness of someone who has already accepted an outcome before confirming it. 2 weeks, he said. If we reduce portions again. The children are already... She stopped, started again. James has lost weight. I can see it in his face. If I reduce his portion again, I know... He folded the paper with the numbers on it. I'm going to hunt. You've been hunting. He had short trips, half a day at most, staying within range of the cabin, coming back with nothing 3 times out of 4, and when he did bring something, it was small. Rabbits, once a grouse. The mountain's lower slopes had been hunted hard by everything that lived there, everything as hungry as they were. Not up here, he said. Higher. She looked at him. She knew enough about this mountain now, a month and a half of listening to him talk about it in the practical, informational way he talked about things, to know what higher meant. The high slopes were avalanche country in deep winter. The snowpack built up in a particular way on the northeast-facing ridges, layered and unstable, and the right combination of temperature change and wind could bring it down with very little provocation. How high, she said. Far enough to find elk. Gideon. There's a herd, he said, and his voice had that quality it got when he'd already decided something and was explaining it rather than discussing it. I've seen their sign on the upper trails before the big storms buried everything. They winter high, up around the ridgeline, where the wind keeps some of the grass cleared. I haven't gone up there this year because I didn't need to. And the avalanche risk? A pause that was a little too long. Manageable. That's not what manageable sounds like. He looked at her. What do you want me to say? I want you to say it honestly. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind was doing its nightly work, pressing against the walls with that persistent insistence that had stopped frightening her and started just being the sound of this place. The risk is real, he said. The northeast ridge is loaded right now. I can see it from the upper tree line. But the elk will be on the southern exposure, above the second draw. Different aspect, better stability. He paused. I've been on this mountain 8 years. I know the safe lines. You knew the safe lines when you were by yourself and could take risks for yourself. Something moved in his face. Not quite acknowledgement, but near it. The alternative, he said quietly, is that the children go hungry. She sat with that. Sat with it the way you sit with something that is true and terrible and doesn't become less true or less terrible, no matter how long you look at it. How long will you be gone? She asked. 2 days, maybe 3. Depends on where the herd is and how the weather holds. He glanced at the window, that involuntary weather-reading habit she'd watched him do 100 times. I want to go Thursday, if the sky stays clear. There's a cold front behind the next one. You can see it in the way the high clouds are moving. I need to be up and down before it comes in. And if you're not back by the time the front hits, I'll be back. That's not... I'll be back, he said again. Not like a reassurance. Like a commitment he was making to himself as much as to her, the kind that a person makes when they understand the weight of it. Tobias can manage the wood and the fire. The children will be fine for 3 days. She looked at him for a long moment. At the scar, at the steadiness of his face, at the set of his shoulders that she had learned over 6 weeks was how he looked when he'd made his peace with something difficult. Take the rifle, she said, not just the hunting bow. I was going to. And the emergency kit, the one on the 3rd shelf with the, I know where it is. Gideon? She waited until he looked at her directly. Come back. It was a simple thing to say. She wasn't even entirely sure what she meant by it. All of it, probably. Come back with food. Come back alive. Come back to the children who had started to depend on your presence in ways they couldn't have articulated 3 weeks ago. Come back because I have moved my entire family into your life, and I am not sure any of us knows how to subtract you from it anymore. She didn't say any of that, just come back. He held her gaze for a moment. Yes, he said. She believed him. That was the strange part. She believed him not because she had any guarantee or any reasonable basis for certainty, but because in 6 weeks she had learned that Gideon Wolfe said what he meant and meant what he said, and he had said yes. Thursday came cold and clear, the sky that high-altitude blue that was either beautiful or ominous, depending on your circumstances. Gideon was packed and ready before the children were awake. She'd heard him moving in the outbuilding through the wall, the sounds of deliberate preparation. When she came out to the porch with Clara on her hip, he was loading the pack, checking and rechecking the weight distribution with the same precision he applied to everything. He had told the children the night before. He'd done it practically and without minimizing. There was food needed, he was going to get it, he would be back in 2 to 3 days. James had asked 3 questions in rapid succession about elk, the answers to which Gideon had delivered with patience. Rachel had asked about the weather, and he'd told her what he'd told Evelyn, and she had looked at the sky with that serious evaluating expression that was becoming her default and said, "The high clouds are moving from the northwest," and he'd said, "Good eye," and she'd stood straighter. Tobias had been quiet throughout. Afterward, when Evelyn was putting the little ones to bed, she'd heard them talking low at the table. She hadn't been able to make out the words, but the quality of it was different from the early weeks. Less friction, more actual conversation. When she came back out, Tobias had gone up to the loft and Gideon was banking the fire for the night, and neither of them said anything about it. Now, in the cold Thursday morning, Gideon swung the pack onto his shoulders and adjusted the straps in a way that suggested long practice. He picked up the rifle, checked it. She noted the habit, automatic and thorough. He looked at the sky, that ritual check. Fire needs restocking by midday, he said. Don't let the coals get too low. It's harder to build back from low coals in this cold than to maintain it. I know. The loose board on the left side of the porch, don't let the children step on the edge of it, the nails working up through the top. Gideon. The horse. Gideon. She looked at him. We'll be fine. Go. He stopped, looked at her, and then at the cabin in a way that lasted just a half-second longer than a practical assessment required. Then he turned and went, his tracks marking the new snow in a straight line toward the upper tree line. And within 10 minutes, the trees had taken him, and the mountain looked exactly as it always looked. Enormous, white, indifferent, keeping its own counsel. She went inside. Tobias was up and starting on the fire without being asked. She watched him for a moment, this boy who was growing into something difficult and earnest and decent in the way that Thomas had been decent. And she thought, we are going to be all right. She thought it without certainty, which was the only honest way to think it. The first day was manageable. Tobias and Samuel handled the outdoor tasks, wood, the outbuilding, checking that Marshall had water that wasn't frozen solid. The younger children stayed in, lessons in the morning, the afternoon a long, sprawling indoor game that Rachel had invented involving a complicated set of rules that changed every 20 minutes, in which James disputed loudly and continuously. Nora fell asleep under the table in the afternoon, which was where Evelyn found her, curled around Henry the rabbit, perfectly content. She caught herself listening for Gideon's footsteps on the porch. The particular sound of his boots, heavier on the left from an old gait adjustment he'd apparently never corrected, the knock before he entered. She hadn't realized she'd learned that sound until it wasn't there. The second day the clouds moved in. Not the front he'd warned about, that was still a day or two out, but a lower cloud system that cut visibility and dropped the temperature another 10 degrees and put a fine dry snow across everything, the kind that didn't accumulate but made the world blurry at the edges. Evelyn told herself this was normal. She looked at the sky in the morning the way she'd seen him do, trying to read what he would have read. She didn't have his 8 years of vocabulary for it, but she had common sense, and what common sense told her was, this is not the bad weather yet. She kept that knowledge close and didn't let the children see her checking the tree line. By mid-afternoon of the second day, Clara was restless and unhappy in the particular way that wasn't sickness, just boredom and cold, and the baby's inability to understand why the world had become so small. Evelyn walked her in circles around the cabin, back and forth, bouncing slightly in that rhythm that sometimes worked. Ruth and Rachel were teaching James some card game that seemed to involve a great deal of slapping the table. Samuel was reading. Tobias was at the window, which meant he was watching the tree line, which meant he was thinking about the same thing Evelyn was thinking about. He said 2 to 3 days, Tobias said, without turning from the window. It's been 2. I know. The weather is changing. I know, Tobias. He was quiet for a moment. He knows this mountain better than anyone. She looked at the back of her son's head. Yes, I'm just saying. He finally turned from the window, and for a moment he looked very young. The jaw, Thomas's jaw, and under it a 13-year-old boy who was scared and trying not to show it in the way that Thomas used to do, that particular genetic stubbornness about fear. He'll be fine. Yes, she said again. I'm going to check the wood. All right. He went out, and Evelyn kept walking with Clara, and the afternoon went gray and then grayer, and the clock on the shelf, Gideon's clock, plain and functional, wound every Sunday, ticked through the hours with complete indifference to any of them. He wasn't back by nightfall of the second day. She put the children to bed, all of them, and sat by the fire with Clara asleep in her lap, and did not sleep herself. He wasn't back by dawn of the third day. The weather was moving faster than he'd predicted. She could see it in the sky, the way the high clouds had thickened overnight, the way the wind had shifted from its regular pattern to something less predictable. The front was coming in early, maybe a full day early, maybe more. She built the fire up, fed the children breakfast from the dwindling stores, the salt pork down to its last few pounds now, the cornmeal measured in spoonfuls rather than cups. James ate without complaining, which told her he was hungry enough to have stopped being particular. Nora ate everything and looked around for more, and Evelyn gave her the last of her own portion. Tobias watched this. Mama, eat, she said. By mid-morning, the wind was picking up in a serious way, and the sky had gone that flat white that meant business, and Evelyn was standing on the porch with her arms around herself and her eyes on the tree line when she heard it. Not footsteps. Something different, a sound she couldn't immediately identify, low and irregular, coming from the upper tree line. She stared. The trees were moving in the wind, and the light was flat and hard to read, and Tobias was beside her. There, he said, and pointed. Something was coming out of the trees, moving wrong, not the straight, deliberate walk of a man in full control of himself, but something slower, lurching, with an irregular rhythm that made her stomach drop. Stay here, she said. Mama? She was already down the steps and into the snow. The distance between the cabin and the tree line was maybe 150 feet, and she covered it in a run that was more stumbling than running because the snow was deep and her boots weren't made for this. And when she got close enough to see clearly, she stopped. He was walking. That was the first thing. He was upright, moving under his own power. But the pack on his back was enormous, far larger than he'd left with, and his left arm was held at a wrong angle, close to his body, and his coat had something dark across the left shoulder and down the sleeve that wasn't the color of snow or mud. He looked up and saw her. His face was gray under the weathering, a gray that had nothing to do with cold, and there was a cut above his left eye that had bled and dried and bled again. "I got the elk," he said, and his voice was steady in the way that voices get steady when a person is using everything they have just to stay upright, when steadiness is a decision being made every second. "What happened?" She was already at his side, her hand on his right arm, the good one, instinctively. She could see now that the pack was rigged with rope, a makeshift harness, and behind him through the trees she could see the shapes of meat cached at the tree line, far more than he could carry in one trip. "Mountain lion." He said it without drama. It wanted the elk. How bad?" "Deep scratches mostly. Left shoulder." He exhaled, a controlled breath, the kind that said, "I've been managing this for a while. One bite that needs cleaning. I've had worse." A pause. "I don't think anything's broken." "You don't think—" "Left arm works, just hurts." He looked at her. His eyes were clear, which she checked for deliberately because she knew enough about shock to know that clarity was the first thing to go. "The lion got the hindquarters of the elk before I had to fight it off. Lost some meat, but there's still enough, more than enough." She wanted to say several things. She chose the practical one because the sky was doing alarming things, and this was not the time for the other things. "Can you walk to the cabin?" "I walked from the second ridge." "That's not what I asked." A beat. Something that might have been a very small, very tired version of appreciation for the distinction. "Yes, I can walk to the cabin." "Then walk! Tobias!" She turned to find her son 10 feet behind her. He had not stayed on the porch, obviously. And his face was doing something complicated when he saw Gideon's state, something that included fear and relief, and the particular furious protectiveness of someone who had been more worried than he'd admitted. "Go ahead and get the fire up as high as it'll go, and get the medicine box from the third shelf and boil water. Now! Run!" Tobias ran. Getting Gideon into the cabin was an exercise in managing two competing stubbornnesses. His insistence that he could do more himself than he actually could, and her insistence that he would accept help whether he liked it or not. He made it up the porch steps without assistance and then nearly went down on the threshold, and she was there with her shoulder under his right arm, and he let her take some of the weight without comment, which told her more about how bad it was than anything he'd said. Inside, the children had arranged themselves against the walls in the way they did when something serious was happening. Not in the way, but present, watching. Samuel already had the kettle on. Tobias was at the fire. Ruth and Rachel stood together near the table with the careful stillness of people who understood that the situation required them not to be a problem right now. James looked at Gideon and said, "You're bleeding." "James," Samuel said. "He is, though." "I know," Gideon said. His voice was fraying slightly at the edges now, the steadiness costing more than it had outside. He sat down in the heavy chair by the fire, sat down more suddenly than intended, the pack making a sound as it hit the floor. "I know I'm bleeding, son." Son. He'd said it without thinking. She was certain he'd said it without thinking. She caught the flicker across his face when he heard himself say it. Not regret, something more complicated than regret. James didn't seem to notice anything unusual about it. "Does it hurt?" "Yes." "A lot?" "James," Evelyn said, her hands already at the buttons of Gideon's coat. "Go sit with Nora." He went, obediently enough, and Evelyn worked the coat off Gideon's shoulders, carefully on the left, where he made a sound when she moved the arm that he immediately controlled, the sound of someone who has decided that sounds like that are not acceptable and then makes them anyway. Underneath, the shirt was worse. The shoulder and upper arm had been dressed. He'd wrapped it himself up in the high country, with strips torn from something, but the wrapping was soaked through and had dried in places and needed to come off. "This is going to hurt," she said. I gathered. "Tobias, come hold the lamp up." Tobias came. He held the lamp steady over Gideon's shoulder, and his jaw was set and his hands were steady, and he did not look away from what the lamplight showed when the wrapping came off, which was worse than she'd hoped and better than she'd feared. Deep parallel lacerations across the shoulder blade, the kind that a large animal's claws made when they meant business. One puncture wound on the upper arm, tooth-shaped, smaller but deeper. All of it needed cleaning, and most of it needed to be closed. She'd sewn wounds before. Thomas had been the kind of man who collected injuries the way some men collected debts, but not like this. Not this extent. She looked at Gideon. I need to clean all of this and close what I can. I have the carbolic from the medicine box. It's going to... Do it, he said, simply. No performance of bravery, no bracing himself ostentatiously. Just the flat permission of a man who has assessed the situation and accepted what was required. She did it. He held still. He made no sound. Once, when she was working on the puncture wound and it required more pressure than the rest, his right hand gripped the arm of the chair and the wood creaked, and that was the only indication. Tobias held the lamp without wavering. Samuel appeared at her elbow with things she needed before she asked for them. He had apparently been watching and thinking ahead, and she filed that away as something to tell him later, that she had noticed, that she was proud of him. When it was over, she tied off the last bandage and sat back on her heels and looked at the work. Not perfect. She was not a doctor, and these were not ideal conditions, but closed and clean and as good as she could make them. Gideon looked at his shoulder, looked at her. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just don't do anything with that arm for a week. There's meat in the tree line that needs to be brought in before the storm. I heard you. Tobias and Samuel will go with me in the next hour before the weather closes. We'll do it in trips. She stood. Her knees were shaking slightly. The aftermath of sustained focus, nothing more. She hoped he didn't notice. You're going to sit in that chair and not move until I say otherwise. He opened his mouth. Don't, she said. He closed it, and there it was. That thing that was not quite a smile. That movement around the eyes that meant something was happening in there even when nothing reached his face. He leaned his head back against the chair. Bossy, he said very quietly, not quite loud enough to be meant for the room. Ruth, who had the hearing of a small predatory animal, looked up from the corner. What did he say? Nothing, Evelyn said. She caught Samuel hiding a smile behind the medicine box. They got the meat in before the storm hit. 3 trips, Evelyn and Tobias and Samuel working fast through the rising wind, hauling what Gideon had cached at the tree line back to the outbuilding storage. There was a lot of it. More than she'd expected, given what he'd described of the fight. He had killed an elk, been attacked by a mountain lion, lost some portion of the animal to the fight, and then spent what must have been most of the night and part of the morning getting as much of the remaining meat as he could carry, rigged up and dragged to a point close enough to the cabin that he could report its location, while bleeding, with an arm that was barely functional. She thought about that on the 3rd trip, her arms full of wrapped meat, the wind starting to throw ice crystals against the exposed skin of her face. And she thought, this man climbed back down an avalanche mountain, wounded, in a deteriorating storm, because he said he would come back. The storm came in hard that evening and stayed for 2 days. Gideon slept through most of the first day, which told her more than any confession would have about how depleted he actually was. He woke in the evening, disoriented for a moment before he placed himself, and then he was fully present again. That fast gathering of self that was entirely his character. He looked at the cabin, the children asleep, the fire, Evelyn at the table with her mending. How long, he said. 14 hours, roughly. He looked at his shoulder, looked at the ceiling. The children, fed, safe. The little ones thought it was an adventure. James gave a full account of everything to Samuel that lasted 45 minutes and covered the part where you said son at least 3 times. She didn't look up from her mending. He's decided you're his particular hero. I thought you should know before he tells you himself. A silence from the chair. Evelyn, he said, and it was the first time he'd used her name without the Mrs. in front of it, without apparently noticing that he'd done it. She looked up. He looked like a man who had several things in his throat that he didn't know how to get out in the right order. He looked briefly like someone who was less accustomed to being cared for than to caring, or rather, to managing alone, which was different. He looked for a moment like exactly what he was, a man who had built walls for 8 years and was noticing, in real time, that something had gotten through them. The children are all right, he finally said. Yes, good. He settled back. His eyes closed for a moment, then opened. The meat. Enough? More than enough. You did what you said you'd do. I said I would. I know you did. She went back to her mending. The fire crackled. The storm pushed against the walls. Go back to sleep. He did. And in the morning, the storm still howling outside and all 8 of them arranged around the warmth and the light. The children doing their lessons, Clara content in her corner, Tobias working at the table on something with a piece of wood and a knife that Gideon had given him. Evelyn looked up from the pot she was stirring and found the smell of cooking meat filling the cabin for the first time in weeks, and she thought, "We are not going to die. Not we will be fine. Not everything will work out. Just the simpler, harder-earned thing. Not going to die. Not today. Not on this mountain. Not this winter." It was enough. For now, it was more than enough. The fever came on the 4th day after his return. She should have expected it. The wounds had been cleaned as well as she could manage, the carbolic applied thoroughly, the bandages changed daily. She had done everything right, or as right as circumstances allowed. But a puncture wound from an animal bite in the high wilderness, dressed in the field with torn cloth before she ever saw it, was not a wound that took well to best efforts. Infection had its own timeline and its own indifference to effort, and it arrived quietly, the way bad things often do, while everything else seemed to be improving. The first sign was the heat. She was changing his shoulder bandage on the 4th morning. He was sitting with his typical rigid patience while she worked, the way he endured necessary unpleasantness, without complaint and without pretending it wasn't happening. And when her hands were near his neck, she felt it. Not the normal warmth of a body healing, something deeper, more insistent. She pressed the back of her hand to his forehead and held it there. He looked at her sideways. "What? You're warm." "I'm fine." "You have a fever." "It's a mild one. It'll pass." She kept her hand where it was for another moment. The heat coming off his skin was not mild. "How long?" A pause that told her he'd been aware of it and had chosen not to mention it. "Since yesterday evening." "You didn't say anything." "It wasn't significant." "Gideon." She moved around to face him. "That is a bite wound, an infected bite wound, on your shoulder, in the middle of winter, 2 hours from the nearest doctor, who has probably left Black Ridge by now anyway." She kept her voice even because raising it wouldn't help, and because the children were in the next part of the room, and she didn't want to frighten them more than necessary. "That is significant." He looked at her. His eyes were slightly too bright. She could see it now, the particular over-brightness of a fever trying to get established. He'd been managing it the same way he managed everything, with sheer stubborn function. "I've had infected wounds before," he said. And I survived them." "You were alone before. If you'd gone down alone, there would have been no one to—" She stopped. "You're not alone now. I need you to act like it." Something shifted in his face. Not submission exactly, more like a man recalibrating a position he'd held so long he'd forgotten to question it. "What do you need me to do?" he said. "Rest. Let me manage the wound. Don't go outside unless absolutely necessary." She paused. "And stop trying to get up when I'm not looking. I've seen you do it twice this morning already." He had the decency not to deny it. "The children need— I have 7 children, and I've been managing them since before you came into the picture. I will manage them." She turned back to the bandage. "I need you to manage yourself." By nightfall, the fever was worse. Not dramatically worse. It climbed the way a tide climbs, incrementally, each hour's reading a little higher than the last. She kept track, the way she'd learned to keep track of Clara's fevers, with a methodical attention that left no room for the fear underneath it, because fear used energy she couldn't afford. She changed his bandages twice more through the day and didn't like what she saw. The wound had the hot, tight look of infection properly established, the edges angry, the tissue around the puncture particularly bad. She packed it with what she had, a poultice she made from the same willow bark tin he'd given her for Clara, combined with everything in the medicine box that had any plausible antibacterial property, which was not much but was what existed. He submitted to this with diminishing argument as the fever climbed, which told her more than she wanted to know. Gideon Wolfe at full capacity did not submit easily to being managed. Gideon Wolfe at 3/4 capacity pushed back. The fact that he lay in the rearranged sleeping area by the fire and let her work without protest meant that some significant portion of the capacity that made him him was already occupied elsewhere. The children understood something serious was happening without being told. They operated with a collective quiet that was unusual enough to be noticeable. Even James, who had the natural volume of a small brass band, brought himself down to a register that was almost indoor appropriate. Ruth and Rachel organized themselves into a working unit, handling tasks that Evelyn assigned and several she didn't, anticipating needs with the practical intelligence they both had in abundance. Samuel took over the fire management entirely, keeping it steady through the day with the careful attention that Gideon had modeled for 2 months. Tobias went outside and did the outdoor work alone, the wood, Marshall, the outbuilding, and came back with snow on his coat and his jaw set, and did not make it into a larger thing than it was. Nora brought Henry the cloth rabbit and left it very deliberately near Gideon's hand, then retreated to her corner with the solemn expression of someone who has done what was in their power to do. He was asleep when she did it, or nearly so. Evelyn saw it and had to look at the ceiling for a moment. The second night was hard. The fever broke through whatever management she was providing and climbed seriously, and by midnight he was in the territory where a fever became something more than uncomfortable. The territory where she had to make herself stay in the room and keep working instead of doing the other thing, the thing that wanted to happen in her chest when she understood that she could lose him. That this man who had walked back down a mountain wounded and kept his word and said son to James without thinking about it, who had silently moved the sleeping arrangement so her baby was closer to the fire, who had sat at the table in the middle of a storm and talked about a woman named Margaret who hated the cold. She could lose him to a fever that had started in a wound that was 4 inches long and less than an inch deep. Because the wilderness was like that. Because life on the frontier was like that. Because nothing here was fair. She didn't let herself stay in that territory long. She built a cool compress and replaced it when it warmed, which meant barely sleeping, moving between the fire and the water basin, keeping track of his temperature by touch, because she had no thermometer. She kept the fire steady, not hot enough to raise the room temperature, which would work against her, but warm enough to keep the children comfortable in the loft. Sometime around 3 in the morning, he started talking, not coherently, not the normal half-asleep, fragmented statements of someone who wasn't fully conscious, something more specific than that. A conversation that was happening somewhere she couldn't see, with someone who wasn't in the room. He said Margaret's name twice. Then he said something about a roof, some specific anxiety about a particular piece of construction, repeated with the circular insistence of fever logic. Then he said, clearly and with a pain in his voice that was completely unguarded, "I should have been there. I told her I'd be back before dark." Evelyn sat very still with the compress in her hands and listened to him tell her, without knowing he was telling her, what had happened 8 years ago. A roof. A winter like this one. He had gone down the mountain for supplies. She pieced it together from the fragments, the way you piece together a broken thing by looking at the edges, and Margaret had been alone, and something had gone wrong with the roof under the snow load, and when he'd come back she was already... He said her name again, and the sound of it was the sound of something that had been carried for 8 years in the same way you carry a stone in your boot. Not debilitating, but never not present. "I know," Evelyn said very quietly. She pressed the cool cloth to his forehead. "I know. It wasn't your fault." He wasn't hearing her. He was somewhere else entirely. "I know," she said again anyway. Not for him, maybe. Or not only for him. She sat with him through the rest of the night. She replaced the compresses. She cleaned the wound again in the early hours when she could see in the lamplight that it needed it. She held the lamp close and looked at the infection and tried to assess whether it was worse or holding or marginally better, and she was not able to be sure. She was not a doctor. She was a woman who had kept 7 children alive through ordinary winters by paying attention and refusing to panic, and she was applying those same tools to an extraordinary situation with the knowledge that they might not be sufficient. They had to be sufficient. She didn't have anything else. By the 3rd day, the children had rearranged the cabin around the situation with the pragmatic creativity of people who have learned to adapt. The table had migrated closer to the wall to create more floor space. Lesson time happened in the loft, Samuel conducting it in a voice low enough not to carry. Meals were cooked and eaten without the normal noise, not in silence exactly, but in a register that understood the room. Tobias sat near Gideon for an hour on the afternoon of the 3rd day, and didn't do anything in particular. Just sat. The way you sit with someone when sitting is what you have. He had a piece of wood and his knife, but he wasn't working it, just turning it in his hands. He was there. Evelyn saw it and didn't comment, because commenting would make it into something it needed to be allowed to just be. On the morning of the 4th day, the fever broke. She knew it before she fully registered knowing it. Something in the quality of his breathing changed around dawn, a deepening and slowing. And when she put her hand to his forehead, the heat that had been there for 3 days was still present, but was different. Fading. Coming down from the peak. She sat back in the chair she'd pulled close to him over the past 4 days until it had essentially become her sleeping chair. And she put her face in her hands and stayed that way for a moment, just breathing. "You're crying," said a voice. She looked up. He was looking at her. His eyes were clear. Actually clear, the fever brightness dimmed, something real behind them. His face was gaunt in a way it hadn't been before, the way faces get when a fever has been doing serious work. But it was his face. Present, specific, his. "I'm not crying," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not," she said, and her voice did something that she couldn't fully control, a slight quality of having been under significant strain for 4 days, and now facing a sudden reduction in that strain. The fever broke. "I know, I can feel it." His voice was a wreck, dry and rough and barely there. "Water?" She got him water. She helped him drink it, which he accepted without argument, which told her he was genuinely weak in a way he'd take days to recover from. He drank half the cup and she took it away, and he lay back with his eyes closed. "How long?" he said. 4 days. A silence. He was processing that, she could see it. The lost time, the gap in his awareness of the cabin and the family, and all the things he'd been responsible for. "The children are fine. Tobias managed the outside work, Samuel kept the fire. The others helped." She paused. "They were remarkable, actually." He opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling. "Marshall?" Tobias fed and watered him every day. He also repaired that loose board on the porch. Did it properly, from what I can tell, say, pulled the old nail, used 2 new ones at the correct angle. A pause. "He said you'd shown him the right way to do it." Gideon was quiet for a moment. He was listening. "Tobias is always listening. He just doesn't always let you see it." Another silence, comfortable in the way their silences had become comfortable. Not empty, just not requiring filling. "I said things," he said, "when the fever was high." Not a question. He'd done this before, clearly. Been sick enough to talk and woken up knowing it. She considered how to answer, what she owed him in honesty versus what served no purpose to repeat. "Some things," she said. "Margaret." "Yes." He didn't say anything for a moment. She watched the side of his face. The scar that had become so familiar, it had stopped being the first thing she noticed and become just part of the geography of him. "It wasn't a secret," he said finally. "What happened?" "No, but it wasn't mine to hear that way." She meant it. She wasn't claiming intimacy she hadn't been given. "You don't have to—" "I left her alone." He said it to the ceiling, flat and precise, the way he said things when he had decided to say them and was not going to unsay them. "I said I'd be back before dark. I was 3 hours late because of a problem with the horse on the lower trail, and the snow came off the east section of the roof while I was gone." A breath. "She was in the cabin. The impact, she didn't suffer, the doctor said, but I—" He stopped. "I was 3 hours late." "You didn't cause the snow to come off the roof." "No." "You couldn't have known." "No." "Then—" "I know," he said. And he said it the way you say "I know" when you know something in your head that your gut has never agreed to accept. I've known that for 8 years. Knowing it doesn't change what I did with the knowing. She understood that. She understood it in the specific way that another person who has lost someone understands it. That grief is not logical. That you can be acquitted of blame by every reasonable measure and still sit with the thing in the dark and find it hasn't moved. "Thomas," she said, not meaning to start a sentence, just saying his name the way you say a name when you need to establish that you're standing in the same territory as someone else. He turned his head and looked at her. "I was angry at him for dying," she said, "for 3 weeks after I was angry at him, as if he'd done it on purpose, as if he'd had a choice." She looked at her hands. "That's not reasonable either. Doesn't stop it from being true." He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "It doesn't." They sat in that for a while. The fire spoke its small language. Somewhere in the loft, Rachel was explaining something to Nora in an earnest whisper that involved several repetitions of the word because. Outside, the mountain was doing what the mountain did. Enormous, white, continuous. The children called you by your name, Evelyn said. While you were sick, Samuel and the twins, they stopped saying Mr. Wolf. She paused. I didn't correct them. I should have asked you. It's fine, he said. Quickly, and then, because the quickness might have said more than he'd intended, it's fine. She noted it. She moved on, the way she'd learned to move on when he'd said more than he meant to, giving him room to not make it into a bigger thing. You need to eat something, she said. Broth, if I can manage it. Your body has been… I'm not hungry. That's not the same as not needing to eat. She stood, straightening out the aches from 4 days of sleeping in a chair. I'll make it anyway. You can refuse it if you want. You've earned the right to be difficult about at least one thing. She heard him behind her make the sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite not one. She didn't turn around. She went to the fire and started building toward broth, and the cabin arranged itself around the fact of him being alive and present and on his way back, and she let herself, for the first time in 4 days, breathe at something approaching full capacity. His recovery was slow, and he was a terrible patient, which she'd expected. Not because he complained, yet he didn't complain, he was constitutionally opposed to complaining about his own condition, but because he was incapable of stillness when things needed doing, and the cabin and the mountain provided constant evidence of things needing doing. She caught him attempting to chop wood on the second day of his recovery and removed the axe from his vicinity with a look that he met with a look of his own, and they stood there for a moment in the cold yard, both of them knowing he could simply take the axe back if he chose to, and both of them knowing he wasn't going to. The arm, she said, is better. Is not fully healed. I can compensate. Tobias, she called. Tobias appeared in the cabin doorway. Take the axe, she said. Tobias came down the porch steps and took the axe from the space between them with the careful neutrality of someone navigating a conversation they've decided to stay out of. He looked at Gideon. Something passed between them, man to man, or the closest approximation available given that one of them was 13 and the other was using his injury as a bargaining chip. I'll get the wood, Tobias said to Gideon. Not deferentially, practically. The way one person who's capable tells another person who's temporarily not capable, I've got it. Gideon looked at the boy for a moment, looked at Evelyn. Fine, he said, and went back inside. And Evelyn and Tobias exchanged a glance that contained a significant amount of information in no words at all. She learned over the recovery days what it looked like when Gideon was not performing health. Stripped down to actual state, he was quieter than usual, which meant very quiet. He sat by the fire in the evenings and watched the children in a way he hadn't done in the early weeks. Not with the wariness of before, but with a different quality of attention, something that had less distance in it. James had made good on what she'd told Gideon, announcing within approximately 3 minutes of Gideon's eyes being reliably open that he was his hero, which he delivered with the full confidence of a 7-year-old who sees no reason to be anything other than direct about this. Gideon had received this information with visible discomfort, then visible recalibration, then something that settled into a sort of gruff acknowledgement. I just got the food, he said. You fought a lion, James said. Mountain lion. That's still a lion. James, it's not actually… He stopped, looked at the boy's face. Yes. All right. James beamed at him. It was a particular kind of beam. Uncomplicated, generous, requiring nothing back. Gideon looked at it like a man looking at something bright. Ruth, who was constitutionally incapable of leaving well enough alone, said, Were you scared? Ruth, Evelyn said. It's a valid question, Rachel said, with the expression of someone taking notes. Gideon looked at them. Yes, he said, after a pause that was honest rather than avoiding. When it came out of the trees, yes, for a second. What did you do? I did what you do when you're scared, kept moving. Ruth considered this. That's good advice. It's the only advice, he said. Rachel wrote something invisible on her palm with her finger, in the way she did when she was committing something to memory, and Evelyn watched and thought, Thomas would have loved these girls. It was a thought that came sometimes, not with the stabbing quality of early grief, but with something that was almost its opposite. A warmth, complicated and bittersweet, that came from knowing him well enough to be sure. On the 8th day of his recovery, Gideon came to find her. She was outside at the water barrel, cracking the morning ice, a task she'd taken over during his illness, and continued because the work felt like something she owned now, a piece of the mountain's maintenance that was hers to manage. She heard the boots on the porch and knew them before she turned around. He was moving better. The careful way he held the left arm still had eased some, the shoulder finding its range again in the way bodies did when given enough time and enough rest, which this one had been given against its will. He stood at the porch edge and looked at her at the water barrel, and looked at the sky and looked at the snow, and she waited because she'd learned that if he was standing somewhere with the specific quality of someone who had come to say something, the thing to do was give him room to say it. "I wouldn't have made it," he said, "through the fever. Alone." She cracked another skim of ice. "Probably not. I've been alone for 8 years and it wasn't—" He stopped, started differently. "I was fine with it. I know. I'm saying it was a choice. I chose it." He paused. "I want to be honest about that." She looked up at him. He was looking at her with the same directness he'd used in the town meeting hall 2 months ago. That weighing quality, except this time it felt mutual. He wasn't just assessing her, he was letting himself be assessed. "I know it was a choice," she said. "I'm not asking you to explain it." "I know you're not. Another stop. Language was clearly not his most comfortable tool, even when he'd decided to use it. "The children," he said. "They managed well. He seemed to be looking for a word that was accurate without being more than he intended to say. "They're good," he finished. "They are. Tobias." He looked at the tree line for a moment. "He's going to be a solid man." Something tightened in her throat. She kept her face even. "Thomas would be glad to hear that. He had a good father before. I can see it." A pause. "I'm not trying to be Thomas." "I know you're not." "I just meant the boy needed someone to show him things. I had things to show him. That's all it was." She looked at him for a long moment, at the deliberate, careful way he was defining the boundaries of what had happened. Not to minimize it, she didn't think, but because he genuinely needed her to understand that he hadn't meant to become something to them, hadn't been performing some slow calculation about how to insert himself into a family's life. He'd just been himself daily, and that had turned out to matter. "Gideon," she said. He looked at her. "You don't have to explain yourself to me." A pause. "I'm not explaining. He frowned. "I don't know what I'm doing." "I know." She picked up the bucket. "Neither do I. Most of the time." She started toward the cabin steps. "Come inside. I made actual biscuits this morning. Ruth found the last of the baking powder in the back of the shelf. They're not very good, but they're hot." She went up the steps. At the door, she looked back. He was still standing where she'd left him, looking at the mountain, at the snow, at whatever it was a man looked at when he was making his peace with something he hadn't seen coming. Then he turned and followed her in, and the door closed behind him. And inside the cabin, all the noise and warmth and complicated ordinary life of 8 people making a family out of necessity and stubbornness and daily survival recommenced around him, and he didn't try to stand outside it. That was different from before. That was, she thought, the thing that mattered. Spring did not arrive the way it does in stories. It didn't come as a single morning of sudden warmth and birdsong, some cinematic thaw that announced itself with ceremony. It came the way most real things come, gradually, imperfectly, with setbacks. A warm week in late February, followed by 3 days of hard freeze that killed the optimism the warmth had built. Patches of bare ground appearing on the south-facing slope below the cabin, then disappearing again under 6 inches of new snow. The creek beginning to move under its ice in a low sound that the children pressed their ears to the ground to hear, James announcing to anyone who would listen that he could hear the water waking up, which was not wrong, exactly, just more poetic than he usually managed. March came in cold and went out something approaching mild, and by early April the lower trail was passable, and the world below the mountain was visible again. The smudge of Black Ridge in the valley, smoke from the remaining chimneys, the thin line of the road threading through the brown and white of the late-season landscape. Gideon told her the roads were open on a Thursday morning. He said it practically, the way he said most things, standing at the door with his coffee and his eyes on the valley. He said, "Roads are clear enough. If you wanted to go down, you could go down." She was at the fire with Clara, who was walking now, had taken her first solid steps in February, crossing the cabin floor toward Nora with the determined, wobbling urgency of a child who has decided that crawling is beneath her dignity. She was 14 months of absolute will in a small body, and watching her navigate the world had been one of the few uncomplicated joys of the winter. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She watched Clara, who was making her way toward the table leg with focused intent. "I heard you," she said. He waited. "I know the roads are open," she said. He turned from the door. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her more often lately, with less of the careful distance that had characterized the early weeks, but also without pressure, without asking for anything. Just looking, the way a person looks when they're trying to read a situation honestly. "I told you at the start," he said. "When spring came, you could leave." "You did say that. So?" He set down his coffee. "If you want to go back down, get the children settled somewhere. I can take you in the wagon, same as I brought you up. There's the Hendersons already went to Cheyenne, or I've heard the Ridgeton settlement has taken people in." "Gideon." He stopped. She finally turned and looked at him. "Are you asking me to leave, or are you telling me I'm allowed to?" A pause. The particular pause she knew well by now, the one that meant he was being careful with language because the language mattered. "I'm telling you you're allowed to," he said. "Those are different things." "Yes." Clara reached the table leg, grabbed it, looked triumphantly at no one in particular, and then sat down hard on her backside and seemed to consider this outcome acceptable. "I'm not going," Evelyn said. He was quiet. "The children are not going." She said it without drama, the same way she'd said "I accept" in the meeting hall back in November. Not as a performance of conviction, but as a statement of something already decided and not particularly open for renegotiation. Not back to Black Ridge, not to Ridgeton, not to Cheyenne. "Evelyn." He said her name with the careful weight of someone who has been thinking about what comes after a long winter and is not sure he can trust his own conclusions. "This is my mountain, my cabin. You don't owe me I know I don't owe you." Her voice came out with more edge than she'd intended. She moderated it. "That's not what this is. I'm not staying out of debt." "Then what are you staying for?" She looked at him for a long moment, at the scar and the gray at his beard, and the hands that had dragged an elk through the snow and built this cabin log by careful log, and held a lamp steady while she set snares with James and turned bark side down when Tobias stacked it wrong. At the man who had sat up until 3 a.m. with her during Clara's fever and said Margaret hated the cold and meant it as the truest possible thing he could say about a person. "Because this is home," she said. "Whether you invited it to be or not, it became home. And I'm not going to take my children away from something that became home just because you're standing there with the door open telling me I'm allowed to leave." The cabin held the silence for a moment. Outside, one of the children was coming up from the lower trail. She could hear boots on the porch, the particular rhythm of Samuel's step. Clara pulled herself back to standing, using the table leg, achieved it, and looked around the room for an audience to appreciate her accomplishment. "I don't know how to do this," Gideon said. "Do what?" "This." He made a motion with his hand that encompassed the cabin, the children, her, all of it. "I've been alone for 8 years. I don't—" He stopped, tried again. "I make mistakes. I'm not easy to be around. I've noticed. I'm not going to suddenly become someone who's easy to be around. I'm not asking you to. The children need exactly what they've been getting," she said, and the firmness in her voice surprised even her. "They need someone who teaches them real things and tells them the truth and doesn't treat them like they're fragile. They've had 5 months of that, and they are not the same children who came up that mountain in November." She paused. "James is going to set a snare correctly before he's 8. Ruth is reading the weather better than half the men in Black Ridge ever could. Tobias—" Her voice did something she controlled. "Tobias is learning how to be a man from someone who actually knows how. Do you understand what that means to me?" He was very still. "I'm not saying it to put something on you," she said more quietly. "I'm saying it because you asked what I'm staying for, and that's part of the answer, the honest part. The door opened and Samuel came in, carrying a piece of rope he'd apparently been working on outside. Looked at both of them, made the silent assessment that something adult was happening and he had no business being in the middle of it, said sorry to no one specifically, and went directly to the loft stairs with the rope. Evelyn waited until he was up before she spoke again. "What do you want?" she asked. He looked at her. The question seemed to catch him somewhere he hadn't expected. "I mean it," she said. "Not what you think is right. Not what you think I need. What do you actually want?" The silence stretched. Gideon was not a man who answered questions like that quickly, because he was not a man who asked them of himself often. She could see him working through it, actually working, not deflecting, not retreating into the practical-minded bluntness that served him so well when emotions required management from a safe distance. "I don't want you to leave," he finally said. And then, because he'd apparently decided that if he was going to say it, he was going to say it properly. "Any of you. I don't want you to go." It was not romantic. It was not poetic. It was a man who had spent 8 years building walls telling her with complete honesty that the walls were no longer his primary interest, and that was worth more to her than anything that could have been dressed up in better language. "Then we're staying," she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he picked up his coffee, and that was that. Not a resolution with music underneath it. Just two people deciding, in the plain light of an April morning, to be honest about what they wanted. The work of spring was different from the work of winter. Winter had been about holding on, conserving, enduring, getting from one day to the next with the people and resources you had. Spring was about building, and building turned out to suit this particular collection of people better than endurance had. Gideon mapped out where an additional room could be added to the east side of the cabin. Not luxury, just necessity, because 9 people in one room with a loft had been survivable in winter, but was not a long-term arrangement. He drew it in the dirt with a stick, and Tobias crouched beside him and asked questions that were specific enough that Gideon started answering them with the detail he'd use for someone he expected to actually help with the construction. "You'd use the same notching as the existing logs?" Tobias asked. "Same technique, yes. Match the existing work so the structure is consistent. How do you cut that angle?" Gideon looked at him. "You'll need to see it done. Easier than explaining." He paused. "I'll show you." Tobias stood up straight. Something in his face, something that had been held carefully in a certain configuration for most of the winter, the expression of a boy deciding whether to trust, eased slightly. Not dissolved, just eased. "All right," he said. They started on the extension in the 3rd week of April, when the ground had softened enough to work, and the timber could be cut from the lower stand without compromising the upper slopes. It was hard physical work, the kind that left everyone too tired for anything but sleep, but it was a different kind of tired from winter. Productive, forward-facing, the exhaustion that comes from making something rather than simply surviving. Samuel had found, sometime in March, a collection of seeds in a tin at the back of Gideon's storage shelf. He'd brought it to Evelyn with the expression of someone presenting something significant. She'd opened it and counted the varieties: squash, beans, 2 kinds of root vegetable. And they'd looked at each other with the shared understanding of people who had spent a winter calculating food down to the last spoonful. "Can things grow up here?" Samuel asked. "At this elevation, in a short season." She paused. "We'd have to try it the right way. Raised beds, south-facing, protected from the wind." "I could build them," Samuel said. "Not someone could, or maybe we should. I could." She looked at her quiet second son, who had spent the winter absorbing everything and asking for almost nothing, and thought that she'd been right to worry about him. Not because he was struggling, but because he was the kind of person who could endure a great deal before anyone noticed he needed something for himself. "Tell Gideon what you're thinking," she said. "Ask him about the soil up here." Samuel found Gideon that evening, and they talked for 40 minutes about elevation and growing season and frost dates. And the next morning, Gideon showed him where the south-facing ground below the cabin was sheltered by a natural rock outcrop that created a microclimate a few degrees warmer than the surrounding slope. He showed him with the same no-nonsense factual quality he used for everything, and Samuel listened with his characteristic quiet intensity, and by the end of the week there was a raised bed framework taking shape below the cabin that was Samuel's project in the same specific way that the snares were James's and the weather reading was Rachel's. Ruth, who needed her own thing, found it in the partial reconstruction of the roof's east section that Gideon had been planning since the snow melted off, and revealed the damage a particularly heavy February load had done to the corner boards. She noticed him assessing it one morning and came to stand beside him, with her arms crossed, looking up. "What's wrong with it?" she said. "Corner boards are warped, need replacing before next winter." "Can I help?" He looked at her. Ruth was 10, compact, and had the stubbornness of someone who has decided that her size is not a relevant consideration. He'd learned this over the winter. "You're afraid of heights." "No." "You sure?" "I'll tell you if I am when I get up there." He'd looked at her for a moment with the expression he got when someone surprised him, which was a specific and fleeting thing. "Ladders in the outbuilding," he said. Ruth helped with the roof repair. She was not immediately good at it, and she dropped 2 of the replacement boards on the second day and had to climb down and retrieve them. And on the third day, she hit her thumb with the hammer and said a word that Evelyn chose, from inside the cabin, to not have heard. But by the end of the week, the corner was solid, and Ruth had the particular look of someone who has done a physical thing correctly and knows it from the inside. Nora planted flowers, not in any organized way. She had found some wildflower seeds in the dirt near the south-facing rocks and had been moving them, with great ceremony, to various locations around the cabin yard that she deemed appropriate. Most of them would not survive. Some of them probably would. Gideon watched her do it from the porch one morning, this small person moving with total seriousness from one patch of dirt to another, and he said nothing. And when she looked up and found him watching, she held up a seed to show him. "It's going to be yellow," she said, with absolute confidence. "How do you know?" She considered this. "Because I want it to be." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. Evelyn, coming out with water, caught the end of this exchange and watched Gideon look at Nora with an expression she had not seen on his face before, unguarded in a way that was almost uncomfortable to witness, the expression of someone in the presence of a thing that has gotten past all the careful management. He caught her watching, and the expression closed up, not defensively, just with the reflexive privacy of a man who was still learning how much to let show. She didn't say anything. She handed him the water and went back inside. Some things didn't need commentary. The confrontation, when it finally came, happened in May, not between Evelyn and Gideon, between Gideon and what was left of Gideon's past. 2 men came up the mountain trail on a Wednesday morning, Lloyd Fassett and Reverend Marsh, the same men who had sat at the front of the Black Ridge Assembly Hall in November and calculated the price of her children's separation. They came on horseback, and they came with the careful diplomacy of people who aren't sure how they'll be received. Gideon saw them coming from the upper yard and went to stand at the edge of the property with his arms at his sides, and his body language said very clearly that they would get no further than he decided to let them. Evelyn came out to the porch. "Wolf," Lloyd said, pulling his horse up. He looked at the cabin, at the new extension framed out on the east side, at the garden beds below, at the evidence of ongoing habitation and construction scattered across the yard. Something moved across his face that was somewhere between surprise and recalibration. "Looks like you've been busy." "What do you want, Lloyd?" Reverend Marsh stepped in, smoother. "We came to check on Mrs. Hart and the children. As a community, we felt—" "We felt what?" Evelyn said from the porch. Both men looked at her. She had not intended to let them do the talking while she stood in the background. She came down the porch steps and stood beside Gideon, not quite deliberately, just because that was where her feet took her. Marsh looked between them. "You've been up here all winter," he said. "With the circumstances being what they are, we wanted to make sure the children were well and that the arrangement was appropriate," she said. A pause. "I wouldn't put it that way." "How would you put it?" She kept her voice even because anger was a luxury that served the other person more than it served you. "You came up here in May to check whether I had done something improper during a winter in which I was keeping 7 children alive. That's what you're here for." Lloyd had the grace to look uncomfortable. "It's not about— we were concerned." "You were not concerned in November," she said. "In November you were ready to send Tobias to the Calhoun place as farm labor." She let that sit for a moment. "You can look at my children, you can see how they are, but you don't get to come up here and make me justify the man who kept them alive." Marsh looked at Gideon. Gideon looked back with the flat patience of someone who has decided that nothing these men say is going to change anything, and has made his peace with that. "The children are well," Evelyn said. "Better than they would have been anywhere else this winter. If you want to see them, you can see them. Then you can go back down and tell Black Ridge whatever it needs to hear. But this is not your business anymore." Lloyd looked at the cabin again, at the construction, the garden, the mountain behind it all. Something in him seemed to settle into an unwilling acknowledgement of a situation that had resolved itself beyond his involvement. "For what it's worth," he said slowly, "we were wrong. About what to do with the family." He looked at Gideon. "And about you?" Gideon said nothing. He didn't need to. They saw the children. James talked at Lloyd Facet for approximately 6 minutes straight about elk tracking and snare mechanics, and Lloyd nodded along with the expression of a man drowning politely. Rachel showed Marsh the weather log she'd been keeping since February. A real log, dates and observations, and Gideon's annotations in the margin where she'd gotten something right. He looked at it with genuine surprise. They ate a meal on the porch in the spring sun, all 9 of them and the 2 visitors, and it was imperfect and a little awkward and entirely itself. A family on a mountain, not performing anything for anyone. When the men rode back down the trail in the afternoon, Evelyn stood at the porch edge and watched them go, and felt something release in her that she hadn't fully known she was holding. The verdict of the valley, the assessment of people who had almost scattered her family like seeds. She had carried it without realizing it, the low-level need to be vindicated, to be seen as something other than a desperate woman who'd made a desperate choice. She didn't need it. She'd known since February that she didn't need it, but it still felt like something setting down a weight, watching those horses disappear around the lower trail. Gideon came to stand beside her. "They'll talk," he said. They were always going to talk. "It won't be unflattering, I think. Whatever they saw." He looked at the valley. "That's probably worse in some ways. Now people will want to know how it was done." She looked at him. "Is that a problem?" He thought about it with the genuine consideration he gave to things that deserved genuine consideration. "No," he said. "I don't think it is." The summer came fully in June. The cabin extension was finished by the end of May. Rough, but solid. Tobias had done 1/3 of the work himself, and the notching on his section was, Gideon said with the particular restraint of someone who does not dispense praise carelessly, good work. Tobias had heard this and looked at the notching and then looked at the ground. And Evelyn had watched her son experience the specific quiet pleasure of being told by someone whose opinion he'd earned that he'd done a thing well. Samuel's garden produced beans and 1 variety of squash that came in before the first frost, small and dense, and tasting like the best thing any of them had eaten since before Black Ridge's stores ran out. He brought the first bean harvest to the table with a formality that was entirely unselfconscious, and made even Gideon put down his coffee and look at it properly. "You grew this," Nora told Samuel. "We grew it," Samuel said. "I planted the yellow flowers," Nora said. "Some of them came up yellow." "You were right about that," Gideon said. She looked at him across the table with the triumphant satisfaction of someone whose confidence in their own judgment has been publicly confirmed. The question of what exactly Evelyn and Gideon were to each other resolved itself in the slow, unannounced way that true things tend to resolve. Not in a moment, but in the accumulation of moments, each one adding to the weight of something that had been building since a scarred man had walked into a meeting hall in November and said, "I'll take all of them." It was Tobias who named it, eventually, the way Tobias named most things, directly and without ceremony. It was an evening in late June, the door opened for the first time all year to let the summer air in, the mountain giving back some of the warmth it had held back all winter. Most of the children were outside, the last of the long daylight lasting until nearly 9. And Gideon was at the table working on some piece of equipment, and Evelyn was across from him mending something that didn't strictly need mending, and Tobias came in from outside, looked at both of them, looked at the domestic ordinary intimacy of 2 people occupying the same space in the evening like they have been doing it so long it doesn't require negotiation, and said, "Are you 2 going to get married, or are you just going to sit across from each other like that forever?" Gideon looked up from the equipment. Evelyn looked up from the mending. Tobias stood in the doorway with the perfect equanimity of a teenager who has said the thing that needed saying and is fully prepared to live with the consequences. "Because it's—" he started. "Tobias," Evelyn said, "I'm just asking." I know what you're doing. Someone had to. Gideon looked at the equipment, set it down. Looked at Evelyn with an expression that was doing several things at once. Embarrassment and acknowledgement, and something underneath both of those that had been there for a while, she thought. Probably since the fever, or before. Probably since the night he'd built the fire while she stood in the doorframe of a strange cabin with 7 children behind her and tried to figure out whether she was making the worst mistake of her life. He's not wrong, Gideon said. I know he's not wrong, Evelyn said. A beat. Well, she said. Well, he said. Tobias looked between them. This is painful, he said. I'm going back outside. He went. She looked at Gideon across the table. This man who was not easy and not simple and was never going to be either of those things. Who had fed her children when she couldn't and walked back through blood and snow because he'd said he would. Who had said Margaret's name in the dark and let her hear it, and said, I don't want you to leave in the plainest possible words, and accepted a 7-year-old's hero worship with gruff, uncomfortable grace, and put Bark side down because it was the right way to do it. I'm not looking for someone to save me, she said. I want to be clear about that. I know. And I don't want either of us to be a replacement for something, for what we lost. No, he said. Neither do I. But, he agreed. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, the scarred working hand, and held it there. He looked at their hands. Then he turned his over so they were palm to palm and held on, and that was how it started. Not with a flourish, but with a hand across a table in the last light of a summer evening on a mountain that had nearly killed them all and had turned out, against every reasonable prediction, to be home. The territory of their life on the mountain was not perfect after that. Nothing on the frontier was perfect. And nothing about 9 people making a life in a place that required constant work and constant vigilance was ever going to be the version of happiness that didn't have hard days in it. Gideon was still not easy to live with, and Evelyn was still not built for asking for help, and Tobias was still 13 with all the friction that implied, and the mountain still made demands that didn't negotiate with human plans or human feelings. But the cabin had 2 rooms now, and the garden had come in, and the woodpile for the coming winter was already half built. James could set a snare and identify 5 different animal tracks, and had decided, firmly, that he intended to become the best trapper in the territory, which Gideon received with more patience than anyone would have predicted in November. Rachel kept her weather log. Ruth could fix a roof. Samuel grew things. And Nora's flowers came up yellow along the south-facing rocks below the cabin in the full summer sun, small and crooked and entirely themselves. Not what anyone would have built if they'd had the chance to plan it from the beginning. Nothing that came from desperation and winter and a man walking into a room and saying, I'll take all of them, was ever going to look like a plan. It was going to look like what it was, a family made from necessity and stubbornness and the specific unglamorous kind of love that shows up not in grand gestures but in bark side down and cool compresses at 3 a.m, and I don't want you to leave, and hands held across a table when the words run out. It was not what any of them would have chosen. It was what they had. It was, all things considered, more than enough.